better understanding about what do we mean by grass affected. So I'll introduce myself. I am Linda Goldsmith-Lord, and I'm the owner and co-founder of Poseidon Animal Health. And for those of you who have joined us before in webinars, in fact, let us know in the Q&A if you've actually done our webinars before, but you will know that we are a company that is so passionate about sharing knowledge and education. And it's not just about delivering the best supplements we can. It's about really looking at how do we create change and make lives better for our horses. So thank you for joining us. And I'm just going to move on now to introducing our wonderful panel. Hang on. There we go. Introduce that panel of experts. Now, what is very unique about tonight is we have an incredible range of experts joining. Because this is a fairly complex topic, what we wanted to do was bring to you a range of experts that can deliver the best information that will help you. And we're really proud to have 2 equine vets and a very experienced equine nutritionist. I'll talk in a moment about what we're covering and also the fact that there'll be lots of questions that come through tonight, and we'll do our very best to answer them, as well as send them out to you post-webinar, but I'll explain more in a moment. So what I'd love to do is hand over to Dr. Roddy, who, as I mentioned, is joining us from the USA. Erin, if you can just give a quick introduction about your background.
Good morning, everyone, or good evening. I am coming to you from Ocala, Florida in the US, and it is very early here, but happy to be with you all and talk about grass. I'm an equine veterinarian. I've worked for Poseidon for 7 years. I spent 12 years in Australia, and now I am here in the US leading the charge as we launch our products here. So excited to talk tonight and get to know everyone.
Thanks, Erin. And Dr. Ethan Romas-Hill, would you like to introduce yourself, please?
Good evening, everyone. Good morning to Dr. Erin. Thank you for being here. And at 4:45 in the morning, I think we had you on. As Linda mentioned, I'm an equine vet, and I've worked in some capacity with Poseidon for about 6 years, but in a more formal capacity in the last 12 months, and also operate my own small ambulatory equine practice in Gippsland in Victoria, and also train dressage horses. So I, like you, am a person pulling hair out about grass effectiveness and the ins and outs of managing horses.
Thank you, Ethan. And Nikita.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Nikita Stowers, and I'm an equine nutritionist. I'm based at the moment in Queensland, Australia, but I'm a Kiwi, so I see quite a few Kiwis have joined us. So thank you for joining us at 9 o'clock at night, and thank you, Erin, for joining us early in the morning. I have worked with Poseidon for, I think, about 4 years now as a consultant nutritionist. And tonight I'm really excited to talk about grass and grass effectiveness because it's a topic that's really close to my heart. And I'm hoping that we can, well, I'm really confident that we can uncover some myths and bring you some good facts about grass effectiveness tonight. So welcome, everyone.
Fabulous. What an amazing team we've got. And we are very proud at Poseidon to be always delivering you information that is accurate, because as we know, in the world of social media, there is often information shared in Facebook groups and chat groups that are actually inaccurate. So here we are bringing you, experts in this space so that you can be really confident about the information that you're receiving. So what are we actually going to cover tonight? We're talking about grass affected, and it's a term that gets thrown around a lot as horse owners, but what do we actually mean? And by the end of this webinar, you'll understand there are so many ways that grass may have an impact on our horses. However, we'll talk in a moment about how much we've changed the life of our horses, and keeping them off grass forever is not always the best choice for every horse. So we'll talk about what that means. Then we'll break that down and talk about the impact of grass sugars. And Nikita will be taking us through these first 2 sections around what do we mean by grass sugars, and then the role of fructans on gut health. Fructans may be a word you've heard of before. And what we'll do tonight is talk about how they can impact on different parts of your horse's gut. Then we're moving into an area that I feel as a horse owner we just don't know enough about, which is mycotoxins. So Ethan will be taking us through what do we mean by a mycotoxin and what damage can they do to our horse's gut, and then ultimately their behavior and health? So that's going to be a really interesting part. And then we're moving on to mineral imbalances. So we're saying that tonight we're talking about being grass affected. There are actually 4 ways that your horse can be affected by grass. So we're being really focused on that tonight. But again, if you've got any questions as we go through, we will do our very best to answer them tonight. Thank you so much to all of you that have sent through questions. Our team's already been answering those, and they will get sent out via email. We plan to get these to you on Friday, but usually in our webinars, we get so many questions that if it takes a bit longer, we'll do our very best to deliver as soon as we can. The final part of the webinar is where we pull it all together and we look at the tips on how do we manage a grass-affected horse. And that's where Dr. Roddy will come in and talk about what are some of the strategies. If we talk about providing optimal health for our horses, it's not just about one strategy. It's about getting the diet right, looking at management techniques, and then looking at where the supplements fit in. So we really want you to go away with some really key takeaways and tips that you can use straight away, and particularly as we approach spring. Now, shout out for everybody to stay right to the end, because we always like to give away a prize pack, and we will be choosing someone tonight that wins the ultimate grass health pack. And when we get to the last bit of the webinar where Erin's explaining what these different products are, you'll really understand that this is a really magic combination. Before I hand over to Nikita, I always love to spend time. It's a bit of a reality check for all of us. We have changed so much about our horses. And at the moment, we tend to be feeding our horses and housing our horses to suit us and not them. And we've made these changes so quickly and so dramatically that their system really hasn't had time to adjust. And so what do we know? We know that it's showing up with so many behavioral and health situations. So it's really time to understand how much what we've done to our horses has impacted on them. In terms of a gut health point of view, we know that they're very reliant on the gut microbiome that exists all throughout the horse's digestive tract. What we do know as a result of all these changes in the way we feed them, we house them, we manage them, that diversity of the helpful bacteria is decreasing, and also the richness of it. So it's time to go back and look at all these changes have had such a big impact on the way our horses perform, the way they behave, their overall health, that it's time as horse owners, we take a step back and we look at how can we do things differently? How can we ensure that what we ask of our horses is okay for them, knowing that we can't go back to the way they used to be, but how do we make it better? And just a reminder of all the ways that we've changed them. So they've gone from being in a herd to often being on their own, to having free choice exercise, to being in small yards, paddocks, or sometimes even stabled, abundant space, enclosed areas. And it goes on and on. We have changed so much for our horses. And the reason we're doing this webinar tonight is that we understand so many of you are frustrated about having to take your horses off grass, knowing that, grass has a role to play in their life, but how do we manage that? So thank you for showing up tonight, because for us, what that says is, as horse owners, you do want to do better, and you want to take information that's accurate from these amazing panel of experts and see how you can improve the life of your horses. As we go through this, we'll also make it clear, and the vets will probably talk about this, or even Nikita, about for some horses, it may mean they can never go back on grass. And we understand that. It's not about guilt, but it's about what if you could make some changes so that your horse could go back and have that opportunity to be grazing and walking and being out in a herd again. So that's our starting point. I'm now going to hand over to Nikita.
Thanks, Linda. So I will try not to go on and on and on about grass, but it's one of my favourite topics. So I will try to just keep it short and sweet with my section so we don't go too far over time. Anyone that knows or has heard me speak before knows that I'm a huge advocate for having horses out at grazing where we can. And keeping in mind that not all pastures are suitable for all horses, and not all horses will actually have the same issues with a given pasture too. So that can make it really frustrating as a horse owner. Tonight, what I thought we'd start off with is just look at some of the basics around grass and forage and what that means for a horse and what that looks like in terms of a requirement. So horses have a significant requirement for fibre. And this is, I guess, two-part. And the first part to that is that they have a requirement just for general gut health. So this is separate from providing energy and calories and nutrients to the horse. So we know that we need to provide them at least 1.5 to 2% of their body weight each day on a dry matter basis. And I think sometimes as horse owners, we can struggle to know what that kind of looks like. So I've given some examples here of what that might look like from a pasture perspective. So if we're thinking about times like spring and autumn, where our pastures can be full of water, they can be up to 85% moisture. So what that means is really for every kilo of grass that the horse is getting, they basically could be getting only 150 grams of actual fibre to meet their requirement. So when you break that down and you look at what that looks like from a total daily consumption point of view, that horse might need to consume 60 or even 80 kilos to meet their fibre requirement. And sometimes the horse physically cannot do that. They just don't have time in the day to eat that much food. And there are also times when the pasture can limit that too. So sometimes we're talking when it's high in water, so spring and autumn is typically when that happens, sometimes in the winter as well. And then in summer, they're limited at the other end because the pasture's too stalky and too mature and it stays in the gut too long. So at both ends of the spectrum, we have issues with seasonality of pasture. So despite this, horses will typically meet their requirements in many situations. If they're grazing, if they're allowed to graze kind of 16 to 24 hours a day. So there's a few kind of caveats around this. And we're assuming that pasture is not overgrazed, so that it's never kind of lower than 5 centimetres in height. We're also assuming that this pasture is kind of perfect and isn't full of water and things like that, like I've mentioned in the previous slide. So it's very rarely the case that pasture will just kind of meet this requirement, and will often need multiple forage sources, especially during certain seasons. This might also look like a bale of hay for an average kind of 500 kilo horse that was off pasture. So they need a heck of a lot of fibre. If horses spend time off pasture as well, because we'll often think about our horses and we think, no, they're grazing all the time. And then we take a look at their day, especially when we're riding them and we're bringing them in and we're traveling them. And all of a sudden we're decreasing that time by hours sometimes. So we need to take a look at that and make sure that we're offering forage, not just from a gut health point of view, well, from a complete gut health point of view, but also for things like gastric ulcers. So we want to make sure that they never have an empty stomach and they're not going longer than about 2 hours without having access to feed to prevent gastric ulcers. So that was kind of the first part where we're looking at how grass can meet a horse's fibre requirement. And then there's the other side of the coin where we're looking at how it can meet, how forage can meet a horse's daily requirement for nutrients. So here we're talking about energy, protein, our minerals, our trace elements. And we know that for horses, they will usually get at least 60% of their daily energy requirement from forage. And if the horse is out at pasture, then we're basically relying on pasture to meet that 60%. And for horses that aren't really hard fed, this will be closer to 90 to 100%. And most of us probably know by now, or hopefully, that horses are high in gut fermenters, meaning that they rely on their hugely evolved hind gut to act as kind of a fermentation vat, where it will help the horse get energy from fibre-based feeds. So this is a process that I think we cover in the next slide. So we could probably flick to there. Linda?
Sorry, it's not
No, you're
moving.
right.
Okay, there we go. Got it.
Yeah, so so horses basically have this hugely evolved hindgut, and they house trillions of bacteria and microorganisms. And basically it's a win-win for the horse and the bugs in the gut, because the horse gives the bugs a nice, safe, warm environment for them to live in. And you can think of it kind of like a fish bowl, if you like. And in return, the little bugs in the gut, or like the little fish in the fish bowl, they give energy to the horse from fiber sources that would otherwise be indigestible. So if you and I went out into a paddock and ate grass as a diet, it would just go through us. Like, it might be good for our gut health, but we wouldn't be able to draw energy from that food. But the horses, because of their well-developed hindgut, they're able to house those bacteria, which in turn give them energy to live and to do the work that we need them to do. So it's really vital, this relationship, and we need to make sure that we keep that hindgut healthy always, which is really important, because some of the things that we'll cover today, we're looking at ways that grass can negatively affect the hindgut health. So one of the ways that we can do this is by giving forage diversity to our horses. And this is probably a fairly new concept that we've started talking about, but we like to kind of have 3 to 5 different fiber-based feeds in the diet. And there's a few reasons for that. But one of the things that it really helps to do is it helps horses cope with change. So it helps them when they're traveling, it helps them when you take them through diet changes, when they're changing paddocks, things like that. If they've got diversity in their diet, then they've got diversity in their microbiome, and that helps them cope with change and stress. So it's a good one to keep in mind.
Thanks, Nikita. I think that's a really great introduction as to, what are our horses designed to eat? And one of the things that we've been really focusing on over the last few years is talking about diet and what should the basis of a horse's diet be. So that's and we're learning more and more as we go. There's constantly new research coming out about the power of the microbiome and what they do. And I think we're only just starting to understand that. But really recognizing where fiber fits in is so important.
Yeah, absolutely. So kind of given that foundation of how, we need fiber to be the base of a horse's diet, and often grass is that base, we're trying to tackle this issue around grass effectiveness. And we've split it into these 4 sections. And I think these 4 sections cover what we know at the moment based on science and based on research and based on what we see out in the field as well. So the 2 sections that I'm going to cover today are grass sugars and fructans. So you might think that these 2 are quite similar, but I'm very glad that we've split them apart, because they're quite different in terms of how they will affect a horse. So grass sugars will be very variable in pasture over the year. So when we're looking at a spring pasture compared to a winter pasture compared to a summer pasture, we'll have variable grass sugar levels. So that's really important to keep in mind. But not only do they vary over the season, but they'll also vary day to day. They vary when we have frost, they vary when the grass is stressed, when it's overgrazed. There's a lot of things that play into grass sugar level, and I think it's one of the reasons why grass sugars are such a problem for horse owners and for horses, and why we see a lot of this kind of explosive behavior, because they really, if you track sugars in pastures throughout the day or over a period of time, they can be all over the place. The other section I'm going to cover is fructans, and these are more an issue for the horse's hindgut. So I think Ethan was talking about maybe an analogy before. I always use analogies myself, and one that I thought of today, it's probably relevant to people, especially if they're parents, but I recently had a 4th birthday for my daughter, and I was looking at games to do and thinking about pass the parcel. And I thought today that when you think about grass sugars and fructans, it can be thought of a little bit like pass the parcel. I hope most people have played this game. You think about it, you're passing it around, and you can think of the grass sugars as like the lollipop or whatever the little treat is that you get in the layers as you pass it around. And so if we think of the grass sugars in those layers, this is how my brain works, and that's the foregut of the horse. And then as we get to the end, we kind of have one big prize or a treat for the lucky kid. And we could look at that as the fructans, and that's what's getting digested in the hindgut. But I think it's often forgotten because we're often thinking about the simple sugars that are getting digested before the fructans. So it's really important to remember both, but remember that they're quite different. And then Ethan and Erin are going to cover the mycotoxins and mineral imbalance, so I will leave that to them. So what are some of the ways that we can recognize that a horse is kind of grass affected? And often these are behavioral things. So we might see that they're increasingly irritable or nervous. They often have kind of these sudden changes in behaviors. They can have muscle tremors or kind of twitching in the muscle as well. I think we had somebody come through to say that they had a horse that was sensitive to touch, and that can be a real issue with grass affectedness. We can have issues with horses being stiff or having difficulty moving. Their eating habits can be a little bit all over the place, especially as their diet changes. We can often get colic-like symptoms and get colics because, one of the reasons I mentioned before, even around grass sugars being really variable, can kind of wreak havoc on the horse's gut. We can have issues around heart rate and respiratory rate, and I think Ethan and Erin will perhaps cover some of those things. And we can also see a horse being overweight, especially with a diet that might be high in sugar, and we can get laminitis from certain things in the grass. Cool, so what I am going to cover, first of all, so remember how I talked about the two different parts. So we're looking at the simple sugars first. So we're looking at the sugar and the starch essentially in pasture. And this can cause problems for all horses, whether they can process sugar well or not. And we're going to get into that in a second as well. But again, just remember that sugar level in pasture is really variable, and it's probably one of the major culprits in terms of grass-affected behaviours and some of the problems that we see. It's a good idea to have an idea what's in your pastures as well, because a lot of people that are based on kind of rye clover based pastures, and a lot of these can be, especially in New Zealand, can be old dairy farms. They can be a real challenge for us horse owners. They can be really high in sugar, really high in protein, and not the most suitable for horses under really good growing conditions. So for simple sugars, this is what I was talking about again with the pass the parcel concept, but they're ideally broken down in the foregut. So this is the stomach, small intestine, and this is great for the horse because it gives them a quick release energy basically. So they're broken down quickly by enzymes, and they give a horse basically an instant energy source. This in itself can actually cause problems, and some of the problems we see with behavior. And this is probably one of the reasons why, for example, oats can get a bad name. Oats are very well digested by the horse in the foregut, but because they're so well digested, they can give that spike of energy that sometimes can cause issues for our horses. That's the same thing with pasture. So at certain times of year, we'll get the same spikes. And when we get too much sugar in the diet, and this is important to note that this can happen with pasture as well, we can get something that happens similar to what happens when we feed too much grain to a horse. So we can basically get sugar overload and starch and sugar escaping to the hindgut, and that causes problems for our horses because obviously we want to maintain a really nice, stable environment for our bugs in the hindgut. And they can't do that if we're getting lots of sugar making its way to the hindgut. what sugar and starch and fructans, which I'll cover in a second, do in the hindgut is they basically drop the hindgut pH. So that makes it more acidic. And then the fiber bugs really don't like that. So a lot of them kind of shift out, and we get a change in the hindgut environment. We can get things like hindgut acidosis, perhaps hindgut ulceration, and similar kind of issues that we see in the foregut with regards to gastric ulcers. We can have issues with the hindgut because of acid. We can get all sorts of issues happening because of that drop in pH in the hindgut. And it is important to note that this can happen from a pasture-based diet and not just a grain-based diet.
And Nikita, can I just add to that, that I think it's important to remember when the gut is so long that when you get that shift in pH and what we call dysbiosis, or that hindgut not balanced, it can be painful. And, that systemic inflammation, and you get horses that are sensitive to touch or brush or a girthy, or you're doing up their rugs and their ears are going back. And I think as horse owners, the more we can understand this, there's not just a horse being arrogant or difficult, it could actually be systemic inflammation and pain. So again, understanding what the processes are that you're explaining helps us understand why the horse is doing what it does and how they're communicating to us.
Yeah, absolutely. So behavioural things are some of the main concerns that we'll have, often with changes in season when horses are out at pasture. And a lot of that, like you say, Linda, is due to pain. And we know from horses with things like gastric ulcers that horses aren't kind of inherently nasty, or they don't want to just, put their ears back or be grumpy about something just for the sake of it. They're usually doing it as a pain response. So yeah, it's really important that we identify these things when they happen, and then look to make dietary changes if we need to. So I've kind of explained when sugars themselves can be a problem. So we get problems with sugar and starch overload, it affecting the hindgut. We also have problems just with sugar in the foregut getting digested how it should. But in some horses, actually processing the sugar is a problem as well. So this is actually another problem that we talk about, insulin dysregulation, where basically horses have an issue with breaking down the sugar and the starch, and they can't process it properly like a normal horse would. So you can see here that just this little graphic, you've got the soluble sugars and you've got the starch, and they basically get broken down by digestive enzymes into glucose that then goes into the bloodstream to be used by the horse. In a normal horse, this process happens well, and the pancreas releases insulin that helps the glucose then to go into cells like muscle, liver, where it's needed. In the horse that's insulin dysregulated, this process is kind of broken. So the horse fundamentally has a problem communicating with the glucose and the insulin, and it leads to basically a buildup of insulin in the blood. And I'm sure that the vets will explain that better than me, but that's just my 1 minute explanation around insulin dysregulation and why it's an issue. And I think we're going to tackle later some of the ways that we can counter that from a dietary perspective. So some of the ways that horses, how a horse can become insulin dysregulated, it's actually interesting to note, and I think Erin speaks about this really well. So if you want to add to this, Erin, feel free. But horses have a real inherent insulin resistance. So they actually, because of how they've evolved and they're supposed to be eating a forage-based diet, they're not really designed to be dealing with lots of sugar at one time. And so in the natural setting, we don't usually have this problem. We only have it at certain times of the year. Unfortunately for us, domesticated horses do a lot less. So we might think that we're working them hard, but in terms of a horse's requirements and how it would be in the wild and how much they were moving, you think about it, if we're riding our horse for 45 minutes a day and then they're just out pretty, just standing pretty still in their small paddocks and sometimes yards and stables, they'll be exercising even less. So we've kind of, I guess, as humans, created a bit of this problem, where we create this buildup of glucose and insulin in the bloodstream, with modern diets, high grain feeding, domestication in itself. You listed a whole bunch of things that we've changed about the horse and their diet and their management. And a lot of these issues are kind of modern day issues, if you like. So I'm going to move on to fructans now, which again, they are essentially a carbohydrate. So they're just basically a more complex structure than a simple sugar. So remember that I said that the simple sugars are digested in the foregut. So this is the stomach, small intestine, but fructans can't be, because horses lack the enzyme to digest fructans, especially some of the larger ones. So what happens with these is it's similar to, like, if you think about them like an unprocessed grain. So we know that feeding, for example, raw corn and raw grains without them being extruded or micronized and cooked in some way will make their way to the hindgut and cause a drop in pH and can cause issues. Fructans can cause those same issues because basically when they get to the hindgut, they're well digested, but it causes the same kind of problem. We get that drive down in pH. And it's probably something that we don't think enough about. And we actually had a question come through around analysis and the difference, because I think people are getting, more aware of looking at things like forage analysis. So I thought I would just briefly touch on this. There are two kind of parts when you're looking at sugars in a grass or a feed analysis. And you've got what we call non-structural carbohydrate. So that's NSC, and most people are aware of that kind of term, and we're usually targeting diets of less than 10% for horses that have issues with sugar in their diet. Within that, you've got water-soluble carbohydrate plus starch, and I'll try not to get too technical here, but then within the water-soluble carbohydrate, you have a subset of that, which is the ethanol-soluble carbohydrate. And then ethanol-soluble carbohydrate, so ESC, plus fructans give you the water-soluble carbohydrate. So if we don't look at water-soluble carbohydrate, then we're not looking at the complete picture from a full gut health point of view. If we just want to look at sugars from a foregut point of view, then absolutely I would look at ESC, but I would cautiously more look to water-soluble and NSC because it takes into account these fructans. And for some of our pasture types, especially our cool season pastures, they can make up a significant amount of the sugar in that plant. So hopefully that didn't confuse the issue further.
If anyone has any questions about that or would like some more clarification, please just send it through the Q&A. And then when Nikita's finished doing her section, I'm sure she can jump on and answer some of those questions.
Yeah, it can be quite a specific area, but for anyone that's had their forage analysed, they probably know what I'm talking about. And we could probably put a slide up showing it, but I think we're going to cover it a bit more in here as well. So what actually happens to these fructans when they make their way to the hindgut? Basically, they're rapidly fermented, as I mentioned, by the bugs in the gut. This can lead to this overproduction of lactic acid. This drives down the pH, which is one of the reasons why, for example, we measure fecal pH in horses. We want to see if diet is having an effect on the hindgut. What happens then is it basically disrupts the balance of the horse's hindgut. It throws out that balance in terms of basically, in simple terms, the good bacteria versus the bad bacteria, and the bad bacteria can take over. This, as you mentioned, Linda, can lead to pain, discomfort, gassiness, distension of the gut, but also some behavioural problems as well, as our horses are kind of coping with this. The other thing that we commonly see as well, and I think it's down here, but I can't quite see the bottom, is that we can get kind of long-term weight loss as a result of a hindgut not functioning optimally. And we see this a lot, and often it can be confused for horses that have gastric ulcers, and people automatically think, oh, my horse isn't gaining weight, it must have ulcers. Often we can have a hindgut issue along with gastric ulcers, or we can have one without the other, but more often than not, we often have hindgut issues as well. So, and what that means is that if we've got a hindgut that's constantly out of whack and its pH is too low, we can sometimes just keep feeding fiber over and over again, but we can't lift that pH. So sometimes horses need additional support to help lift that pH back into a healthy range, so that then the fiber-based feeds we're putting back in can get well digested. That leads to weight gain. So sometimes people put all their kind of eggs in the basket of gastric ulcers, and I guess I'm just trying to point out that often we can have hindgut issues too.
I think that's really important, Nikita. And as we keep learning about equine gut health, we understanding it's not just about the stomach. If the gut's up to 30 meters long, there is so much more the horse's digestive tract than just the stomach. And, understanding that, yes, gastric ulcers are absolutely a major concern, but there is so much more to equine gut health. So I think that's, really important to keep reinforcing that point.
Yeah, so as I mentioned before, we do have a bit of seasonal variation with fructans, just as we do with grasses, with sugars as well. So we have differences in terms of when in the season they might be higher, but they can also be higher at different times of the day. And similar to our simple sugars, we know that fructans can often be lower in the morning and higher in the afternoon. So we can keep this in mind when we're looking at grazing management, for example, or if we're looking at harvesting for hay or for another conserved forage. So it's really important to kind of look at this seasonally and think about your horse's diet seasonally too. So when I work with clients directly, I would usually assess their diet each season, because we get, especially when they're out grazing, that's when we're getting the biggest changes that are happening over those times.
Thanks, Nikita. We've gone through quite a lot in those first two sections. So again, before I pass over to Dr. Ethan, just a reminder, any questions that you have, please send them through, because we will answer all your questions, ideally tonight, but if not, we can do those questions. We'll send those replies to you post the webinar. So I'll hand over to Dr. Ethan now to talk about mycotoxins. And Ethan, you have to take yourself off mute.
I did say to everyone, don't do that. And of course I did it. Okay. So I'll jump right into it. I think it's fairly essential to include mycotoxins in any discussion about grass-affected horses. And I'll start to explain a bit more as to why as we go along. But I just wanted to first make sure that we're all on the same page of what a mycotoxin is. I think it's one of those topics that gets brought up a lot and not explained fully, because there's an assumption that people either don't want to know or don't have the capacity to learn about it. But everyone is here tonight to learn something new. And I think it's something that it's about time we start really talking more about. Working with a lot of people from a lot of countries around the world, I know that Australian horse owners are probably right up there with the best in terms of managing and feeding their horses. So it's a topic that I really like to discuss. So a mycotoxin is basically a toxic compound that's produced by a fungus or a mold. And it might seem challenging to grasp, like I said, as it's not as commonly discussed as other microorganisms, the fungus and the molds. But like Nikita said, I like to make analogies and build on things that we already know and tag on new information so that we can build on these concepts. So I'll relate it back to bacteria, because we're all a bit more used to talking about bacteria and understand it a bit better. So if we consider the bacteria E. coli, we know that it can be dangerous because it produces chemicals that can destroy the gut lining and spread throughout the entire body, causing systemic illness. Fungi and mold can actually behave fairly similarly. They produce their own toxic compounds that can spread through the entire animal, leading to disease. So if we take a look at the image over on the right, you'll see some moist lucerne with a spiderweb-like structure through it. That's actually fungal hyphae. So they're the string-like structures that are formed by the fungi, or by the mold, which actively produce toxins. So now I want you to imagine that we dehydrate that structure that we're looking at there, and the lucerne will dry up, and so will those fungal hyphae as well. You'll lose the visible hyphae, but the toxins will still be there, posing that same risk of causing disease. So to illustrate just how little toxin is actually needed to cause harm, again, we'll use an analogy, and I'll use one specific group of toxins as an example. You don't need to know each individual group. I'll explain a bit further later on why that's not that important to know all the names and whatnot, but aflatoxins is one specifically potent toxin group that you'll find in corn, often corn that hasn't been stored correctly. And like I said, it's very potent. So a mere 20 parts per billion is enough to cause significant signs of illness. So to put that into perspective, 220 parts per billion is like adding 10 mils or 2 teaspoons of aflatoxin to an Olympic-sized swimming pool, and then letting that amount evenly spread throughout and having a horse drink from it. And that's how much you need to cause illness in a horse. So this is why we can't rely on our ability to see fungi or molds to assess the risk of mycotoxins. So another concern about mycotoxins is they can have both acute and chronic effects. Obviously, our acute effects are immediate and generally severe, while chronic effects might develop slowly and subtly and going unnoticed until significant disease has developed. The signs of mycotoxicosis are troublesome because they can be non-specific, but they should always be considered in the setting that we're talking about now, especially during times of the year when grass is more likely to be affected by these toxins, pardon me. So mycotoxins, the production increases during specific seasons because just like bacteria, they have specific conditions in which they need to thrive. I'll often say that if you can see mushrooms around in the paddock, then there's probably mycotoxins about as well. It's just we're seeing the macroscopic fungi forming. So late summer and autumn, I would argue, depending on where you are, sometimes earlier in the spring, this is because the fungi actually also thrive off the rapidly growing or particularly abundant vegetation. So they have a symbiotic relationship, much like the bacteria in the hindgut of the horse. They've got a symbiotic relationship in that they will feed off the plant and have somewhere to live, and the plant then has protection from being eaten because either the animals don't like to eat it, or they get sick when they do, so they won't, or they die when they eat it. That's the whole point. They're a protective mechanism. And so stress conditions in the environment can then also in turn change how the plant's behaving and increase that mycotoxin production, which leads to high levels of the grass. So coming out of drought, coming out of frosts, coming out of floods, that kind of thing can actually be really high risk periods. So it's crucial to keep mycotoxins in mind when evaluating the behavioral and health issues. One of the most striking effects of mycotoxins is on the nervous system. So those neurological and behavioral changes, which can include, as we can see here, the spookiness, tremors, altered behavior such as aggression. And again, I'm going to throw another analogy at you that will be hard to forget. So something so small, it can be hard to rationalize how that has such a profound effect on such a massive animal. And I want you now to all think about the pop culture references that you've seen to magic mushrooms. So these active compounds in these mushrooms, which is often psilocybin, is actually a mycotoxin. It's just one that we don't often think about as a toxin because people use it recreationally. But these can actually significantly alter consciousness and perception, which is why it's not surprising that mycotoxins in horses can cause strange and aggressive behavior. When you start to rationalize it that way, it starts to make a lot more sense, some of the behaviors that we see, and they may just go away and we can never explain them. Mycotoxins can also alter the function of the ovaries and the testes. So this can lead to increased behavioral issues like that naughty mare behavior, as the ovaries respond by either producing too much or too little, too much progesterone, too much estrogen, too little progesterone. And it may even upregulate the production of testosterone in stallions and cause aggression or dangerous behavior. And so these often are seen in the breeding season and can be related directly to their feed intake. Additionally to that, mycotoxins can then decrease fertility in mares, leading to things such as failure to conceive, early embryonic loss, or even mid to late term abortions. We talk about this a lot in cattle and sheep medicine because there's a much greater financial implication of it. We don't want an entire herd of sheep to have early embryonic loss or late-term abortions, but I think that it actually gets overlooked quite often in broodmares, which are often more likely to be fed diets that are contaminated with mycotoxin, because they often get fed like homemade haylage or just pasture rather than hard feeds. They're actually eating a lot more pasture than, say, our high performance horses. And it's usually that long-term exposure to mycotoxins that can lead to those chronic health issues. It can be anything from cancer to kidney damage to liver damage, which I've seen just in the comments. We've got some horses that are maybe showing signs of photosensitivity or edema, which could be linked directly to some liver damage or kidney damage. I'm not saying that they are, but these are things that we always have to keep in mind because it can spread everywhere. And in some cases, if enough quantity is consumed, and depending on the actual toxin, whether that's over time or in a short period, it can result in sudden death, and often we never get a true diagnosis for these. So then we can talk from a gut health perspective. I recognize I'm rattling through this all very quickly. I want to spend the entire hour on this, but I just want to give you all a taste and why it really matters, why it ties in so well to grass effectiveness, and our whole mission behind the gut being involved in every process in the horse is that mycotoxins actually are directly related to the development of a condition known as leaky gut syndrome, which I personally don't like the name of because it sounds fake, but leaky gut syndrome is the scientific name. And what it is if we look at the image on the bottom right, you can see a bunch of gut cells that are held together by nice tight junctions and a thick layer of mucus over the top with healthy little villi on there. We've got a good separation of the cells with that basement membrane, and the blood is uncontaminated. So that's basically a cross-section of the intestinal wall. When we look at the above image, we can see that those junctions have broken down and we've lost a lot of our protection. And that's allowing not only mycotoxins to enter the bloodstream, they're having the effect of breaking it down, but these chronic intake of these mycotoxins can break down these tight junctions of the mucus layer, allowing other pathogens and toxins to pass through into the bloodstream. And this compromises the gut's ability to act as an immune organ and also affects nutrient absorption, leading to those systemic effects that might manifest as poor coat condition, failure to thrive, or just constant illness. So it's a really strong connection there, and if it's something that we can't overlook, and it's too easy to do so. And so I briefly mentioned about the different types of mycotoxins, and it is essential to understand that there are different types of mycotoxins. I'm going to just describe them as polar and non-polar here. And these types are structurally different in their polarity, and that affects how they're managed in the body, which the polarity is basically just how balanced the molecule is, whether there's more charge at one end or another. That's all we really need to know. That's going to affect how they get broken down, how they dissolve in water and whatnot. So some of these mycotoxins will freely dissolve and can be bound and removed, while others require deactivation before they can be effectively eliminated. And that's really important to think about, because I actually get asked frequently, why can't I just buy the cheapest mycotoxin binder? Or this one says that it binds everything. Not all mycotoxin binders are the same. And this is why we need to make that consideration, because often you won't know it's not working until it's too late. And Dr. Erin is going to talk to us a bit about mycotoxin binders a bit later in the presentation. So that's all I'll say about mycotoxins for now, because like I said, it can be a full lecture in itself. But just keep them in the back of your mind, especially if you're not feeding a mycotoxin binder, because as Linda mentioned, it's all about finding out why our horses do the things that they do. And when we understand the why, we understand the how of how we can help them rather than just blame, which I think is really important in our progression of our relationship with horses. And so now, if I can click back into it, yes, there we are. We're jumping over to mineral imbalance and balancing our pastures. So again, moving on from mycotoxins and back onto what Nikita spoke about with the most common causes of this grass-affected behavioral changes being from grass sugars, probably what it most of the time is, but understanding that not only do the sugar and energy levels change in pasture throughout the year, we're also looking at the changes in the mineral and electrolyte balance, and also that effect that has on the horse's own mineral and electrolyte balance, which sounds really, really confusing. So I want to run through this in the most simple way that I can, and effectively say that not only does the amount of the minerals that you're getting in count, the balance with each other also counts. And I replied to a comment in the Q&A before where someone spoke about feeding kikuyu grass. And we're talking about, oh, how much calcium should I feed? How much is that going to affect my horse? And that's when it starts to get really tricky, because how much calcium you would feed is actually dependent on some other factors as well. And then we have to worry about how much is that calcium going to stop the absorption of something else. So it becomes really hard to keep that balance. Something that's really handy is on the side there. I've popped in just an example. This has come from the US, but it is an example of what a pasture assessment looks like. So like a grass test or a pasture test, which I haven't pulled apart. It's there just an example, so you can see what kind of things that you will get. But you can see we've got things like our calcium, phosphorus, magnesium, and that is great to have if you can get it, because then you can make a more targeted approach to balancing your horse's diet. What does this have to do with grass effectiveness? So I spoke briefly then about the relationship with, as an example, calcium and magnesium. Calcium and magnesium aren't recognized as different things by the body. So calcium will preferentially be absorbed. Oversimplification, but that's kind of how it works. And so in periods where magnesium is low and calcium is high, we might lose that basic level of function we need with magnesium, which includes muscle relaxation, general calmness, calms the nervous system, and may shoot up into calcium, which high calcium in horses is not a huge issue unless it stops that magnesium imbalance, which then leads us through to potassium. And so this is now becoming a grass shift. So in the springtime, for example, we can see a higher level of dietary potassium in the grass. That's something you can see on pasture testing. And again, it's competitively absorbed. So potassium that goes overboard will decrease our magnesium. Now, these ones are a particular problem at this time of year because they not only competitively are absorbed, they have kind of opposite reactions in the horses. So magnesium we tend to associate with muscle relaxation, calming, nervous system calming, and potassium is, what drives our sodium potassium pumps, which speeds up our nervous system as an oversimplification. So when we get this imbalance, we have these more reactive horses, the horses that might show signs of tremoring. In the quarter horse populations, there's specific diseases where they're particularly sensitive to the potassium, and it can actually even paralyze them. So the point of this is not to tell you to feed more magnesium or to feed less potassium, but to approach it empirically. And Dr. Roddy is going to speak more on management strategies, but once you're aware of exactly what's going in and the effect of these things, you again start to get a better understanding of why you're seeing the things that you are. Do I have another slide? Right. So again, this is repeating a lot of what I've just said, but broken it down into four key areas there. obviously pasture management, you can't always get a pasture test, but using programs, this is not a plug, but using a program like Feed Excel can be really great to predict the averages depending on the time of the year. So you can get a bit better of a response. We can't always do gold standard. I like to call this practical nutrition, where we just do what we can to the best of our abilities for our horse. But guessing in this day and age it's doable, but it's not necessary. It's just not necessary. And
We can do better.
We can do better. We can do better than guessing now. We don't need to put anything in the horses that they don't need. And that works twofold, because the horse doesn't need it and we don't need to pay for it. We've spoken about absorption relationships. I think we've touched on that enough. That's just a nice little taster there, so that you know that it's not all about feeding more, feeding less. It's about the relationship between the multiple things that we're feeding. So sometimes simplifying the diet and being aware what's actually in there is the better way to do it. And we've spoken briefly about our electrolytes, what they do once they're in the body, and how important they are for cellular function, and how our whole horse's body is one big electrical system. And when we talk about mineral imbalance and what goes in and what goes out, we're actually talking about how that electrical organism is functioning and firing, and everything that they do is powered by the shifts in these electrolytes. So again, tying back into grass effectiveness, that just makes sense. We've got horses that are sensitive to touch, horses that are twitching, horses that are feeling particularly fizzy. Super high potassium can even lead to things like heart attacks. So it's all these considerations that we have to have, and it starts to explain a bit what we're seeing. So I won't delve too far into this, but this is an example of what we might see in a poorly balanced diet, where there might be over supplementation of some things with a bit of this and a bit of that, just guessing. And this might be a diet where there's 5 supplements being fed, but they're the complete wrong supplements. And it makes us feel good. It might look pretty and the horse might love the taste, but vitamin B1 deficiency, we know that a lot of our B vitamins, they can help with the calming effect on horses. So if we're deficient in the B vitamins, well, of course, we're going to see a horse that's grass affected. We've obviously got other key nutrients there as well, but I don't think I need to go too far into them. The key idea here is don't guess. Linda said it greatly. We can do better. And until you know that you are hitting, or with a good degree of confidence that you're hitting everything the horse needs and not overloading it to the point of toxification, don't just write it off as a behavioral thing. Don't just change everything all at once. We're all capable of being a little bit of scientists and using a bit of the scientific method and finding our problem and testing one hypothesis at a time. But we do need that background data first. And it's very, very easy and very, very cheap to get. So that's what I really want the takeaway to be from there. And then I'll handball over, or Linda will take on.
Ethan, thank you for that. The passion with which you spoke about mycotoxins is brilliant. You explained that simply, and I absolutely agree. We do not talk enough about mycotoxins. We don't understand what they do, but they are everywhere and they can create catastrophic change. So thank you so much for that. And also looking at the role of vitamins and minerals. And again, we have to stop guessing. Talk about gold standard. You have someone like Nikita, who has spent her career working with people looking at pasture assessment, looking at diet and how to get the absolute best. So we've just looked at 4 ways your horse can be grass affected. And you may be sitting there feeling a little bit overwhelmed going, well, okay, I thought I was here to learn about one thing. Now I realize there's 4 things I need to think about. So that's why this next section will be really, really useful. We had to make this webinar a bit longer because we wouldn't do it justice if we just made it an hour and just threw all this at you. If we gave you the background, now we can move into what do we do about it. And I'm sure you will love the passion with which Dr. Erin takes us through some of these strategies. So Erin, I'm going to hand over to you.
Thanks, Linda, and thanks, Nikita and Ethan, for laying such a good groundwork for everyone to understand why we're having issues with grass. And thank you all for all your questions. There have been some fantastic questions coming through. It's always nice to see how passionate and engaged everyone is with trying to improve their horses' lives and your lives too. That's a lot of work to own a horse, and especially one that is a problem. So I appreciate where you're all coming from, and hopefully we can give you some good tips. This is the real part, the prevention and management. So we're going to take you through some hopefully really good tips that maybe you haven't thought of, or maybe we can expand on to make your horse's life a little better and your life a little easier. What to feed grass-affected horses? This question has come through quite a bit already, and I've tried to answer you as many as I could. The biggest thing is, of course, as Nikita said, we still need to remember that horses are designed to eat forage, and particularly long stem forage. I had a few questions come through about chaff. Now that I'm in the US, it is very great for me not to feed chaff anymore. I am not a fan of chaff. Chaff is not long-stemmed forage. It actually doesn't do a lot for your horse other than bulk up the meal, which if you need to do that from a gastric perspective, I still think you can do it better with long-stemmed forage. So we want to feed 1.5 to 2% body weight in a variety of fiber sources. There were a few of you that said 1.5% is still too much for your horse and you need to keep that horse on 1%. And I understand that, but let's make sure we're doing that under veterinary advice, which a lot of you were. And also let's make sure we're doing that in as low and slow a way as possible. So we need to use slow feeders to do that. Hay nets, sometimes you do need to get quite creative. I love going on Pinterest and Facebook groups to see all the different creative ways there are to slow down our horse's intake of their forage. And I would recommend you all do a deep dive on that if you're struggling, because there's some really creative ideas out there. Low sugar forages are really important, particularly in horses that are grass affected. And I know that can be hard to come by depending on where you live. And that's where sometimes we do need to get a little bit more creative in terms of soaking hay, in terms of sourcing hays and maybe storing them throughout the year, which is something that can be hard to do depending on your circumstances. But if you think about it and buy hay when the low sugar hay is really available and then store it, that will make the rest of your year easier. So a little bit of work up front and then pays off in the end. If you have a horse that's not an easy keeper, but still grass affected, that's where we want to turn to things like fats and oils rather than grain, and really looking at what you're feeding, looking at the ingredients. It's really easy to go in the shop and just pick a pretty bag, but you need to educate yourself. And there's lots of resources on YouTube, and we've done quite a lot of articles and blogs about this, actually reading that label and making sure that if you are trying to feed the not so easy keeper, but that is affected by sugar, that we avoid cereal grains and grain-based feeds, and making sure that that's not included in a bag. It's a lot of bags say cool and calm and, pony safe on the front. And then when you actually read the label, they contain cereal grains and they contain sugar ingredients. So do try to educate yourself. And if you're going to feed a complete feed, make sure that it is actually a feed that is low in sugar and low in starch for these horses. If you're confused, which it's a lot to take in, we have a free program called Feed Assist on our website, which can help you assess what you're actually feeding to your horse. And then I always recommend consulting an independent equine nutritionist. They are fantastic. If you can get in with Nikita, that's amazing, but there's lots of them out there. And it really takes that guesswork out of what you're doing with your horse. And particularly, I know a lot of you have your horses agisted, or you have pastures that are difficult to manage. And in those tricky situations, consulting an expert makes a huge difference. So these are some kind of practical tips for how you can manage that pasture intake. We need to remember that the pastures we graze our horses on now is not what they were designed to graze on from an evolutionary standpoint. A lot of our pastures are old piggeries or dairy pastures, or they've been artificially seeded and fertilized to make them actually unsuitable for our horses. So it's not necessarily that your horse can't have grass, it's that your horse can't have the grass that we as humans have grown for them. Most of these horses, if you turn them out on actual native pastures that are stemmier and more fibrous, they would do just fine. But these very rich pastures are very difficult for the horses to manage. So we need to be a little bit creative about how we put them on those sorts of pastures. So these are just some tips. We spoke about with quite a few of you in the question and answer, strip grazing, which a lot of you are doing, which is great. And that's just allowing the grass to grow long, putting the horses on the long grass and keeping them off the short grass while it grows. Track systems are a really cool, I wouldn't say they're new, but they're getting a lot more traction on the internet. And there are some amazing track systems that you can look up. And that just encourages your horses to keep moving. As Nikita mentioned, horses were designed to move almost continuously. So 18 hours a day, they would be continuously moving, burning off this sugar, burning off these calories that they're taking in, not standing there and gorging. So trying to design your pastures, design your turnout such that that's what your horses are doing. Putting water away from where the horses feed. If you can have a hill, I really like feeding horses at the bottom of the hill, having their water at the top so that they have to go up and down the hill. Grazing muzzles are fantastic to slow down the intake. They are not cruel. I would much rather see a horse with a grazing muzzle on being able to be turned out for longer than to not have a grazing muzzle on and be locked up. You know, that old saying, motion is lotion. Motion is lotion for everything, for joints, for muscles, for the gastrointestinal tract. Anything that allows horses to be out moving and grazing more is going to be really beneficial for their whole health system. And not forgetting how much just having one buddy for turnout makes horses move more. That buddy will move them around, they will play, they will go to different areas. Where if horses are turned out alone, particularly if they're a little bit not confident horses, they'll often just stand still because they're not confident to move around in their pasture. But finding them a friend that they can move with makes a huge difference. And just that constant walking really burns up the sugar and the calories really well. So I had a lot of people ask me questions about when grazing is safe, and that does depend quite a bit on what type of grass you have. And so sometimes that's a question that you will need to work with a nutritionist on, specifically what type of grass you have and where you live. But typically, the best grazing times are early in the morning and the first few hours of daylight when the sugar levels are at their lowest. And if you're looking at trying to bring pasture and turnout back into your horse's life, that's absolutely when I would start. Again, with anything, change in horses needs to be done slowly. So if you've decided, you know what, I think I do want to try putting grass back into my grass affected horse's life, I applaud you and we're here to help you, but let's make sure we do that really slowly. Start with 15 to 30 minutes for a few days, see how they do. And then if they're coping well with that, you can extend it. But the safest time is going to be those early hours of the morning. And then we're going to talk about stress. And it seems like a bit of a non sequitur, but it actually isn't, because we're learning so much more in the research about how stressed our horses actually are by all of the things in their lives. They're prey animals, so they're designed not to show us that they're stressed. And I actually love this photo because if you look at this horse, this is an experienced competition horse. I know this horse really well. She's standing in that trailer looking calm. But if you know things about pain scoring in horses, this horse is actually stressed. The way her ears are, the way her eyes are held, even the tension in her body and the way she's holding her neck, this horse is stressed. She's well used to being in that trailer and still she's standing there. You can see when you look at her that she's a bit concerned about what's going to happen next. What we know now from research is that as horses stress, it really affects their physiology, both their muscles and their GI tract, as well as their psychological stress. So reducing the stress in horses is really important. And one of the biggest ways you can stress your horse is actually by starving it. Horses are not designed to go without food. They are designed to eat food continuously. So when you remove that food, you are causing a lot of stress. And that stress increases the cortisol levels. So it becomes a bit of a vicious cycle. You're trying to starve your horse to reduce the sugar in their bloodstream, but by stressing them, you're increasing the cortisol levels, which does the same thing. So starving the laminated horse is not the answer. Feeding them rich pasture may not be the answer either, but we need to find a middle ground where we're not starving these horses. Exercise is my favorite thing, and it's really hard, particularly if you have a laminitic horse who maybe isn't super sound at the moment. You do need to be very creative with the ways that you can exercise them, and obviously stabilizing their laminitis first and getting them sound enough to work is going to be your number one task. But after that, remember that horses are designed to consume this sugar. Not as rich of a sugar as some pastures have, but they are designed to consume it. They just are designed to consume it and then burn it. So sometimes there was somebody who said they were walking their horse 3 times a day, which I really applaud you on that. That shows a lot of commitment. But doing those kinds of things, so using a track system, bringing in some artificial exercise like a treadmill or a walker where you can have your horse working without maybe your interaction, or maybe you can work a few horses at a time. Just getting them moving and burning sugar makes a huge difference in their ability to cope with their diet. If your horse isn't the soundest, then starting with some hand walking, working with your vet to maybe use boots or the way that you can actually start walking that horse. But even if we look at obese people, even just starting to do a little bit of walking, it's amazing how quickly the weight comes off and gets that metabolism going again and actually burning the calories. Particularly, again, I'm going to go back to turnout. The biggest things we see both in prevention of grass affectedness and in gastric ulcers is that horses want freedom, forage, and friends. So really trying to bring back their freedom, their ability to socialize with each other, and bringing back long stem forage makes a huge difference in almost all the health issues we see in horses. And now we come to supplements. And the biggest thing about supplements is that we can't do it perfectly for our horses. Most of us, because of the pastures that we have or the way that our horses are kept, whether they're agisted or they're boarded or just our lifestyle, if you work and maybe you can't get your horse out 3 times a day, or you don't have the ability to change your pasture, supplements can fill that gap and they extend our horse's ability to cope with the stressors in their lives. Sometimes you might have inherited a horse that has insulin resistance or is metabolic or has some laminitis history, and that has nothing to do with you. And now you're trying to manage it the best you can, but that horse has come to you with some challenges that you need to deal with. We also want to do more with our horses than just let them graze. I mean, it would be fantastic if we kept horses just to look at them and they were in a big paddock with their friends, and you know, that would be great. But most of these horses have a job. We want to ride them, we want to compete them, we want to travel, we want to enjoy our horses. So supplements can help us do those things where the horse might otherwise be struggling. Again, as we've discussed before, well-balanced diet always comes first. Supplements do not exist in a vacuum, and just throwing a supplement at it is not going to fix the problem. You need to assess your diet, you need to assess your management to the best that you can, and then look for supplements. When I recommend supplements to clients, I always, again, we spoke about reading the label. Just because something is on the shelf doesn't mean that it's safe for your horse or that it's beneficial for your horse. You can put anything on a shelf. It is a very low regulated industry. You can write whatever you want on the label to an extent. You can put whatever you want in the powder, slap a lid on it, and call it good. So we need to be informed consumers. We need to understand the ingredients. Do your research. Make sure that those ingredients are backed by science. Make sure that what it says on the label is actually in the bucket, and that it's an effective ingredient at an effective level. Because, you know, people talk about probiotics a lot, and probiotics are a really easy one to understand. You need about 50 billion CFU of a live probiotic in order for that to be effective. I can think of maybe only 1 or 2 supplements on the market where I've actually seen that number. I'm not a probiotic fan. I won't get into that in this talk, but that's a really easy example of how you need to make sure that what you're trying to give your horse is actually what's in there. If you want to give a probiotic, we can talk about that, but make sure that you're giving 50 billion CFU. If you're not, you're just wasting your money. And a really good way of telling if it works or not is, what are other people saying? If there's lots of reviews out there saying this didn't work, it didn't do anything for my horse, or it caused a negative consequence, that's probably a supplement to stay away from. If a lot of people are saying, yeah, this was great, I saw an improvement, that's a good one to head towards. So a lot of you have asked, you know, what can I give my horse to help with this situation or that situation? We've discussed 4 different ways that horses can be affected by grass, or that they might be struggling with their lifestyle and management. And we have a range of 4 different products to address those issues. So we're going to go through each of these, but if you've sort of picked out, as you've been listening to my colleagues speak about issues that might be affecting your horse in particular, this is the supplement that I would suggest you head towards to start.
Sorry.
she's going to take us through.
Sorry, technology. I'm letting the team down.
Yeah,
Yeah.
not my friend. So we're going to start. I've actually, my internet connection for the first time ever has been sketchy this morning. So I've been kicked out of this webinar about 3 times, and I'm hoping that it holds for my whole section.
So we.
Metabolize is the first supplement we're going to talk about. Metabolize is a really cool product. It is a proprietary blend of flavonoids, and flavonoids are naturally occurring and should have occurred in all of our diets. We should all be getting flavonoids. And humans are as bad as horses. We have changed our diet far away from what we were naturally designed to eat. Nikita spoke about us not being designed to eat grass, and we are not. But we are also not designed to eat cheeseburgers and fries either, even though they're delicious.
Unless they're from inside out, Erin.
Especially if they're from In-N-Out. They're especially delicious if they're from In-N-Out. But we are designed to eat fruits and vegetables, and leaves and roots and twigs, just like our horses. And those don't taste as good as beautiful, rich pasture does for horses. And they don't taste as good as burgers and fries to us. But by eating what tastes good, or what might look pretty in a feed bag, we're not getting these really important natural ingredients anymore. And that has caused a lot of issues in our horses and in our own health. So what flavonoids are designed to do, is to help regulate the sugar in the blood. They improve the insulin sensitivity. They help manage the immune system by regulating inflammation. They play a really important role in our horses' lives. And our horses are just not getting them anymore because they're not getting access to those wild pastures. Someone wrote a really great comment in about they'd love to see more education about pasture management, and I completely agree. The way that we manage our horses' pastures is really kind of abominable. Overgrazing and stressing the pastures, and then seeding with grasses that are inappropriate to horses, fertilizing, etc. Going back to as natural a pasture as possible. I spoke in another webinar actually about grazing hedges. So one of the new developments is planting hedges that horses can graze on, and hedges are more similar to some of the wild plants they would have eaten. And really, if you can think about how to manage your pasture, that's going to make a huge difference in your horse's ability to cope with it. But for a lot of people, that's not possible, whether you don't have pasture or the grass is unsuitable or your horse is adjusted. So that's where we want to try to bring the flavonoids back into the horse's life so that we can provide that as a part of their diet. And we see huge improvements in their ability to manage, process, and metabolize the sugar. And they can actually go back to working how they were supposed to work inside by including these flavonoids back in their daily diet. And it's doing it without a drug. So this is a great case study of a Welsh pony mare who was really struggling to process sugar. And obviously she had some health issues. She was assessed by a veterinarian. She was in the position that I'm sure a lot of your horses and ponies are, where we're seeing changes on radiographs. We're seeing changes clinically in the pony's ability to move around. Then we do the blood work and we see significant elevation in insulin. A lot of veterinarians will recommend medication at this point, and sometimes that's the right choice. That medication has never been designed to be used long term. And with a lot of these horses, just doing medication short term doesn't fix the problem, because you can't necessarily change their lifestyle. And some of these horses, the insulin resistance is so chronic, it can't be reversed. It can only be managed forever. So Metabolize was introduced at the same time as the medication. The medication and Metabolize work together to help control this pony's clinical signs. And then we're able to stop the medication and maintain the pony on Metabolize. And that's the goal, is for this pony and all the ponies to remain on pasture, to be able to have their normal life, have their freedom, have their forage, have their friends, but in a way that is safe for them with the medical issues that they have going on. So who is Metabolize for? I've mentioned this a little bit. Horses that struggle to process that grass sugar that Nikita spoke so well about in the beginning. And if you've identified your horse as a horse that struggles to process grass sugar, obviously our metabolic horses, our cushingoid horses, our laminitic horses, those horses that are overweight, you can't get weight off them. The person who wrote in that they were feeding 1% of the body weight in hay and still struggling with weight, your horse is a prime example. Certainly our hardier breeds, the reason that the Welshies and the Shetland ponies look like they look is because they're designed to live on the side of a rock and eat very little and still survive. And now we have them on rich pastures. But I see metabolites help a lot of horses, warm bloods, any horses that are struggling with their ability to process sugar, and not always even from a weight perspective, but from behavioral perspectives, from inflammatory perspectives. It sends the sugar to the tissues where it should go to, the muscle, the liver, and the brain, and directs it away from being stored as fat or just floating around in the blood sugar, causing inflammation. Fructans, there have been so many good questions about fructans, and they are a very sort of under-discussed topic, which I'm glad that we got to bring up. And I know Nikita loves fructans and did a really good job of explaining them. And I think there's something we need to think about more. So fructans are not real good for your horse when they get to the hindgut, right? And then we get hindgut acidosis. So making sure that if there's fructans in the diet, that they're digested where they should be digested and that they're not passing into the hindgut. So supporting enzymatic activity in that foregut and getting the fructans broken down. Obviously, reducing the intake of fructans is a good start, but sometimes that's not possible to do. And again, we come back to that point about supplements, which is sometimes you do the best you can and it's still not perfect. Most of the time it's not perfect. So using a supplement in a judicious way to help fill those gaps can really make a difference in your horse's health and in your life. A lot of people ask me about pH. How do we assess our horse's hindgut pH? Oh, I wish that we could. That would be very exciting. And I've had some thoughts about how I'd like to do that. We can measure fecal pH. It's not a perfect representation of what's going on in the hindgut. It gives us a good idea. And certainly if that's something you want to do with your horse, it can be a lot of fun to do that. And I know Dr. Ethan and I love going on wormholes about fecal pH and measuring that in our horses. What we can assume is that because of our horses' modern diets and their modern lifestyles, most of them are existing at a level that is too acidic, both in the stomach, which is why we see so many problems with gastric ulcers, and in the hindgut, which is why we see so many issues with hindgut acidosis. So lowering the pH through diet and management is what we've done. And now sometimes we need to include a supplement to help raise it again. We try to do that through diet. Again, I had somebody write in about chaff and their vet advised them to feed green chaff. I am not a fan of chaff. I would always go long stem forage and fiber sources in a complete feed. But sometimes that's not enough, particularly depending on the type of pasture that you have, the type of hay that you have access. So using a pH buffer and making sure that it's a pH buffer that works in both the foregut and the hindgut is really important. And I think that's one of the reasons that we see so many 5-star reviews and so much good feedback about digestive EQ and digestive RP, which are our daily gut supplements, is because our pH buffers are effective throughout the entire gut. And they really work to affect that change. There's a lot of buffers on the market that don't work. So you feed them and you don't see the change. But when you use active ingredients at an effective level, which is what we've done, you really do see that improvement in your horse's health. So digestive EQ is a complete gut health supplement. As I mentioned, it doesn't just have one mode of action. It does a lot of things. That's our goal with our daily supplements, both the EQ and the RP, is that this is a complete gut health supplement. So it's going to attack a lot of the issues that we see in horses through diet and management. And hopefully it eliminates your need to feed a bunch of different things that may not work together. So we talked about buffers. The amino acids provide fuel for the muscles, but they also provide fuel for the entire GI tract. They help that GI tract heal, they help it be strong, and they help it resist the onslaughts that come from the diet and management issues we see in our modern horses. Dr. Ethan spoke really well about calcium and magnesium. So we've focused on that a lot. When should we use digestive EQ? For me, any modern day horse. If your horse isn't out there on 100 acres with a band of friends living their best life out of Yellowstone, not being ridden, then they probably need a gut health supplement, because it is very difficult with our modern day diets, our modern day management, and our modern day pastures to recreate what the horse should be getting. So if your horse is struggling with any of these issues, digestive EQ is a great place to start. And again, that's one complete gut supplement. I'd love you to feed that twice a day. If you can only feed it once a day, that's okay, but twice a day is ideal and a really good place to start to see improvements in overall health and gut health in particular, but really overall health, because the gut is everything. And when would you want to go to digestive RP? I had someone come through with a question. Their horse is on EQ and still struggling, and that's a horse I would suggest try digestive RP. Digestive RP effectively has higher levels of our active ingredients, and that's for horses that have more stress in their life. Maybe they work harder, maybe they travel more, maybe they eat more grain, or for me, horses that digestive EQ is just not enough for them to deal with the challenges. And remember that every single horse is different. Their microbiome is different. Their ability to handle stress is different. Their genetic variation is different. Their history is different. So we can make some generalizations, but every single horse needs to be looked at as an individual. And sometimes the horses just need more help. Toxin binders. We said we were going to talk about toxin binders, and we're going to talk about toxin binders. So Equibind is our mycotoxin binder. And as Dr. Ethan alluded to, again, you need to be really careful with what people put on the shelf. Lots of things will bind toxins. If they are an indiscriminate toxin binder, I know that's a big word, but indiscriminate basically means they just go around and they bind everything. They'll bind mycotoxins, but they'll also bind everything else. They'll bind the nutrients your horse eats. They will bind medicine. They will bind all sorts of things. They'll bind to your hay. They will bind everything because they are indiscriminate. So what that can lead to is that your horse isn't getting the nutrition out of their diet. They'll miss vitamins and minerals. They may not get their medication. In particular, if you're feeding an ulcer medication and a mycotoxin binder, you're probably just binding up your ulcer medication with your mycotoxin binder, and neither of them are working. So it's really important that you feed a discriminate mycotoxin binder, which is why we've produced Equibind. So this is a discriminate mycotoxin binder that is designed to bind only mycotoxins. Very important. And in horses that struggle with mycotoxicosis, and Dr. Ethan spoke about how many different ways mycotoxicosis can affect your horse, this can be an absolute game changer. You will see, we had some people say they saw improvements in a couple of days, and that is absolutely correct. If your horse is struggling with mycotoxicosis, as soon as you remove those mycotoxins, you'll start to see improvements, and the improvements will just continue. And mycotoxins are everywhere. They're in pasture, they're in hay, they're in feed. They are one of those things that you really struggle to see. Sure, you can see the mushrooms, but just because you don't have mushrooms doesn't mean you don't have mycotoxins. And they can literally be in your bag of feed. They can be in the bale of hay that's sitting in your shed, and your horse is being affected by them. Some of those effects can be really strong. Some of them can just be mild. I've had horses that just, we'd say in American vet school, they just ain't doing right. And that can be mycotoxicosis. Those mycotoxins are just low-grade inflammatory mediators that are causing these horses to have low-grade issues. They just ain't doing right. And you bind those mycotoxins, you remove them from the horse's system, and these horses just bloom. Sorry, I got off on a tangent, but you can read the slide. The mycotoxins can damage anything. They cause leaky gut. They also cause a lot of skin issues. I don't know if you've ever had a horse where you've got a new batch of hay, particularly our lovely chestnut horses. I'm a big fan of a chestnut with a big white blaze and white socks. And all of a sudden they've got these ugly pink scaly things on their nose, and their hind legs are sloughing off. And that can be mycotoxicosis. That can be the mycotoxins in the hay causing those horses to become photosensitive. And you can change the hay. If you haven't got the choice to change the hay, adding a mycotoxin binder can really improve those horses' situations. What makes Equibind different, as we discussed, it is a discriminate mycotoxin binder. So it binds the mycotoxins and deactivates them, but it allows the horses to still process their nutrition and their medication if they need it. Dr. Ethan talked about polar and non-polar. I have a Bachelor of Science in Chemistry, so I'd be very happy to talk about polarity with all of you all day, but I understand that that might be a little complex. But what it's important to know is that we have chosen a sophisticated mycotoxin binder that is going to work to just eliminate these nasty guys, but not interfere with the horse's ability to absorb their nutrition. And that's really important. It's low in NSC, so it's safe to be fed to any horse. And obviously most of our horses that are struggling with mycotoxicosis also don't do well with sugar. So that was important to us, that they not have to choose between taking in sugar and taking in this mycotoxin binder. Okay, now I'll hand it over to Dr. Ethan, I believe, to talk about digestive VM.
I can talk about digestive VM until the cows come home. I wasn't sure that I was talking about digestive VM, but I am happy to. If Nikita, did you want to speak on this one? All right, okay. Let's keep it really, really simple. There are a lot of vitamin mineral balances on the market. That shouldn't be new information here. Why would you choose to use digestive VM? Why would you choose to use a vitamin mineral balancer at all? And my personal philosophy in terms of, again, I'll throw back to what I said earlier, I call it practical nutrition, whereas I'm not a nutritionist, but I have to advise people on managing their horses. That's my area of passion, is managing the modern horse. And that encompasses nutrition, it encompasses feed, it encompasses saddle fit, all of those things. So that's where the practicality comes in. We also spoke about wanting to hit a number of different fiber types and vary the diet throughout the year, not only throughout the year, but every day of the week you can slightly change your horse's diet depending on how much work they've done. So it becomes really hard to make sure that your horse is always getting what they need. I feed probably 6 different fiber types to even my brood mare. If I then added in a balancer feed at an amount that would give her what she needs, I'd put her over her nutritional requirements in a lot of places. So it's really easy for me to feed everything from my brood mare up to my horses training FEI dressage on a completely fiber-based diet, and then use a mineral balancer, which I use digestive VM, with them at a rate that's determined by a calculator, so I'm not guessing again, and they can get a separate amount each, and I know that they're hitting their requirements without overdoing it. In some cases, you might be only deficient in one tiny area, especially with smaller horses, and it can be more cost effective to just supplement that one thing. But in most cases of what I've seen, it's a little bit shy of everything, especially B vitamins. B vitamins are really, really common. And if your horse is not, doesn't have an effective hind gut, where a lot of B vitamins are made, again, we're going to that grass effectiveness. The horses are quite good at making a lot of things, but that's only when they're running perfectly. And that's why, like digestive VM, it's a fail safe in a lot of ways. It's there was some comments about selenium deficiency and toxicity. That's one of those. I know that's Nikita's passion child there, but deficiency and toxicity can look really similar in those, which has kind of been a result of a lot of products having lots of selenium in them to balance the fact that a lot of soils are deficient in selenium. Those same soils are often fortified with selenium. Then we get a lot of products with selenium, and you can see where I'm going. So we start to get those toxic effects. So what digestive VM is really overall above everything else designed to be is safe.
And if I can just add a little to that, Ethan, no, you're doing a great job. It's just, as I guess someone that's spent a lot of their career analysing pasture and seeing where the gaps are, I was super happy to come across digestive VM, because I would plug it into Feed Excel with almost any pasture and hay or forage-based diet, and it would fill those gaps. So from a trace element perspective, that's where we usually see a lot of the gaps: copper, zinc, iodine, selenium, and it's just a really nice fit for a forage or a pasture-based diet. So and especially in, I think you covered as well, but I'll just touch on it again, in situations where you're feeding less than the recommended rate of a feed, remember that when us nutritionists formulate hard feeds, we formulate it at that feeding rate. So you'll only meet, for example, their copper, zinc, selenium requirement if you're feeding 4 kilos, if it says to feed 4 kilos on the bag. If you're feeding 1 kilo of the feed that it says to feed your horse 4 kilos of, you're likely deficient in a lot of those areas. So it's a really great product for not only just forage-based diets, but also filling the gaps where you need that top up. So I just adding.
No, that's a great addition.
Can I just quickly jump in?
Mention, sorry.
Just on everything you're saying there, Nikita, I wanted to let everybody know that we are improving our online free feeding program, Feed Assist. That our technical team have been working with FedExcel to make sure that Feed Assist is up to date now in terms of fiber diversity and all those extra things we've been talking about. It is a fabulous tool. So it's still there on the website, but we will be relaunching the new version soon. So there are no excuses. As Ethan said before, no guessing. Jump on and use this free tool to see whether your diet is balanced. It will only add digestive VM if your horse's diet needs it. So, we don't need to guess. We have so many great resources and tools out there. So I am going to just jump in and I'm just looking at the time, and particularly the people in New Zealand, you've done so well to hang on to the end. What an amazing webinar. There is so much information that we've gone through. And what I would love as we're winding up, if you could jump on and answer the poll, let us know if this was helpful. We'd love to hear from you. What did you find useful? What would you have liked to know more about? What wasn't so helpful? Because as I mentioned earlier, Poseidon's not just a company that wants to develop great products. We want to deliver education. And when we have access to an incredible technical team that you've had access to tonight, we want to use them in really effective ways. So we want to hear from you. What do you want to learn more about? What would you have liked to have covered more today? It's been a brilliant webinar. And even though, along with the rest of the team Poseidon, we live and breathe equine gut health, I always learn something new. I really loved focusing on the fructans and the mycotoxins. And each of our presenters delivers with such passion and knowledge and commitment that we are so blessed to have them working with us at Poseidon. So, the polls are coming in already. It's great that you've all got so many great results from this webinar. And hopefully you're all walking away with just one thing different that you can do. So just to sum up, I'm about to announce the winner of the gut health pack. Or the grass pack, I'm not sure what we called it, but a reminder that we will be taking all the questions. The team have been working really well during this webinar to answer those. We will collate those. We will send those out to you. If you love this webinar, tell your friends about it, because we will be doing more. But again, we want to hear from you. What are some of the topics that you would like to hear from? So the winner of the grass health pack is Chris Salter. Chris, we will reach out to you. If you can also just put your name in the Q&A and give us a shout out, so we can then make sure we can reach out to you. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Erin, Nikita, and Ethan. Amazing. I'm so blessed to work with you every day. And Erin, thank you for getting up so early. I've just come back from the US, where I had the privilege of spending some time with Erin, and I am just in awe of her knowledge, as well as Nikita and Ethan. You really have a team that are leading the way in equine gut health, and the information you've got tonight is the best that we can deliver. So thank you for joining us. Thank you for giving up your Wednesday night and sharing it with us. Thank you, team. Thank you, everyone, and have a great night, and hopefully we'll see you at the next webinar.
Thanks, everyone. Have a great night.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks for all the questions. We will make sure that we answer all the questions that we haven't got to live, and everyone will get a list of all the questions and answers after the webinar. And also you'll be able to access the webinar after if you'd like to watch it again, and it will be available on YouTube in case you have any friends that you think would benefit from watching it. They'll be able to go on and watch it as well. So just want to make sure everyone knew that.
Thanks for that, Erin. I should have actually thrown it over to the team. Did you want to add anything else?
We'll be here all night. We'll be here all night if I start adding.
Okay. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. And thanks for sharing stories in the Q&A as well, guys. Even if they weren't questions, just sharing your experiences with products. They always make me feel really, really good. But even just some great success stories in there, which are why we get up and do what we do every day, giving you the tools and the information that you need to enjoy your horses. So thank you for sharing.
Fabulous. Thanks, everyone. We're just trying to work out how to finish the webinar. Otherwise, we will be here all night.
Erin and I could start discussing about the polarity of specific
we
psilocybins.
could go back to polarity, and we could bring back up the fructan carbohydrate image. That would be a good one to get going on.
Because I cut off the edges.
Yeah. Don't mind some polarity.
We figured it out. Okay. Good night.
Yes.
So well.
Bye.